Welcome to 5 and 5 from the One Stop Co-op Shop, where I discuss 5 key elements of a game in about 5 minutes. I'm Michael Kelly, and today I'm looking at one that Colin did a playthrough of recently, Uprising, Curse of the Last Emperor. And a disclaimer that I was sent a review copy of this one. Uprising is a solo and co-op fantasy 4X conquest empire building game, something that I'd never seen before until recently, so glad these are coming out. How did I like the final version? Let's find out and get to the list. So first, for my number 5, I'm starting on a bit of a downbeat with a mix that leans con, and that's the cooperation when you play the game with 2 to 4 players. Now, on the positive side, there are some cool ways to cooperate here. One of the nicest is the quest cards, which often give benefits not only to you, but to other players. Even if you're on like the opposite side of the map, you can still give benefits to each other. And then with you putting your stuff on the map and moving your armies around, you can decide who's going to take out which boss and try to defend each other and stuff. So there is some potential for cooperation. But the reason this is a mix, and in some games might even be a con, is that a lot of the game you're kind of on your own side of the board, building your own empire, protecting your own little area. So it does feel like you're often doing things by yourself, and it's too costly to go and help out other players. But I'm up to a full-on pro for my number 4, which is the action system in the game, kind of the core thing you do on your turn. And you take these very quick micro actions. You might use one of your HMs to move and then start a combat, or to trade for some items, or to tackle a quest. And the great thing is that even in an epic feeling, huge 4X game like this, these actions are very, very fast. Combat is by far the longest, but that's still only maybe like a minute, even for the most intense battles. So it's really great for 2 or even 3 or even 4 players, which again, for such an epic game, is a really impressive achievement. The fact that they can keep the game flowing so quickly with these simple, straightforward actions. But I'm flipping from a pro to a full-on con for my number 3, such an important one to be aware of, and that's the potential for snowballing and for some player count issues. Now, I'll start with the player count issues because these aren't as severe, but you spawn these kind of like boss units for each of the 2 sides, the Undead Horde and the Corrupt Empire, and they usually aren't scaled for players, which I won't say for sure that it's a bad balance decision because I haven't played the game enough at all the player counts to really get a full feel for that, but it at least feels weird that you have the same number of bosses and like main units on the board with 2 players as you do with 3 or 4. But the bigger issue is the snowballing, and to be fair, this is something that is kind of core to a lot of 4X games in general. And what I mean is, if you lose a huge battle, if a boss sneaks in with a surprise activation and takes your core haven, you have fewer resources. You don't have the resources you need to build those units back. So if one player kind of gets in a ditch, gets in a rut, it can be a somewhat negative experience for everybody. But I'm flipping back again to a full-on pro for number 2, although this one does have a big caveat, and that's the combat in the game. This is a fully dice-based combat system, and even though it can be very random, we'll get to that in a second, it's really exciting, it's really consistently tense. The units have different dice they roll, you can level up into these different powers, and then the terrain can play a huge role. Like, some of the enemy bosses are very much nerfed if you fight them in specific terrain, so you get into like kind of tactics on the wider strategic side of the battle, trying to make sure that the enemies go down certain paths and picking your timing so that your units are waiting for them at the exact right moment. It's a lot of fun, super exciting. The one big thing to be aware of though is because the dice can have great luck for you and terrible luck, kill your entire army, or have you destroy the entire enemy at the drop of a hat, it can be very swingy and it can be very random. But I'm going to end with a full-on pro, no caveats in my number 1, and that's the faction variety, the hero variety, the enemy variety, just lots of fun little elements in here. So first, look at the factions. They each have different units, they each have different resources they want to focus on, and they sometimes pay different resources for the actions. And then they have different heroes to choose from. Those heroes have different skills they bring into the game, and then you level up in each chapter, and it's a nice level up system where you draw 2 and pick 1, so you have variety even in the same games. You can't always like pick the exact same build. And then the different heroes get to buy different items, and the items have far-ranging and huge effects, but only certain heroes can equip certain items. So in each play, with each faction, with each hero, you get a lot of like fun variety to mess with. And I have to mention at the end of this number 1 point that you are fighting not 1, but 2 crazy factions, the Undead and the Empire, and kind of trying to get them to fight each other, and the variety in their champions they bring out, and the different ways they work, and kind of how they score victory points differently. It's a pretty streamlined system when you really get down to it once you know the rules, but but it's really exciting and leads to a lot of like great thematic, epic combat and stories to tell. Overall, I would recommend Uprising to anybody who is a fan of big, crunchy, epic 4X games, although not that crunchy. This is, again, a fairly straightforward game to learn, and especially if you've wanted a 4X that is solo or co-op, this one is so easy to play. If you like faction variety, if you like super tense combat, if you like cool strategic decisions, you might love this one, but you might want to avoid it if you don't like randomness of dice, because man, it can crush you. If you're worried about snowballing, if you're concerned about balance issues, or again, I'll say potential balance issues at lower player counts, solo, it can be a lot to kind of handle, multiple factions, but I think it's the best way to play the game. So there are some potential things to be worried about, but overall, I think this is a great 4X experience. And Colin did a playthrough of the first 2 chapters of the game. I also have my old Kickstarter playthrough, which still mostly applies for the finalized game. So feel free to check either of those out if you want to see the game in action. Good gaming, and I'll see you at the next stop.